It was a bitterly cold evening in late November when I, Dr. John Watson, found myself once again by the fireside of our familiar sitting room at 221B Baker Street. The coals glowed warmly in the grate, casting their light upon Holmes's angular profile as he reclined in his armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin and his sharp, hawk-like gaze fixed upon the ceiling. Outside, the wind carried with it the sigh of London's unrest, the rhythmic clatter of hansom cabs, the distant calls of newspaper boys, and the ever-present whisper of fog pressing against the window panes. It was one of those nights when the city itself seemed to conspire in secrecy. Holmes had been in one of his more introspective moods since the Morning Post had failed to deliver anything of substance. For nearly a week, no new case had presented itself worthy of his attention. He had spent much of the day in silence, alternating between scraping dissonant notes from his violin and pacing the length of the room like a caged falcon. When he was in such a state, I'd learned that silence was the best companion. Suddenly, a sound, light, deliberate, and unfamiliar, broke through the monotony. 3 slow knocks echoed from the hallway below, not the brisk, anxious tapping of a petitioner in distress, but rather the calm, measured rhythm of one who comes with purpose. Holmes's eyes flicked toward me. "You will observe, Watson," he murmured, "that our caller is neither desperate nor hesitant. He is accustomed to being received. A man of position, most likely." Mrs. Hudson's footsteps ascended, followed by the murmur of a man's voice. Deep, slightly hoarse, with a trace of aristocratic reserve. A moment later, our visitor was shown in. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark overcoat, the collar turned up against the damp night air. His gloves were still speckled with the fine mist of the fog, and beneath the brim of his hat, his features were partially obscured. Yet even in that dim light, there was something unmistakably haunted in his manner. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he began, inclining his head slightly, "my name is Sir Reginald Penmore. I am in rather urgent need of your counsel." Holmes gestured toward the empty chair by the hearth. "Please, Sir Reginald. The fire is yours, and so, for the moment, are we. Pray, tell us what shadow drives you through the fog to Baker Street at this late hour." The baronet removed his gloves and hat, revealing a pale, drawn face. The face of a man who had not slept well for several nights. His eyes darted once toward the window, as though half expecting someone to be lurking there. "It concerns my home, or rather, something that has taken residence there. A presence, Mr. Holmes. A shadow." Holmes did not move, but his gaze sharpened. "A shadow, Sir Reginald." "Yes," the man said quietly, his fingers tightening upon his walking stick. "At first I dismissed it as imagination. But within the past fortnight, strange things have occurred. Doors found open which I am certain I had locked. Footsteps in the corridor when no servant was near. Last night I discovered a single candle burning in my study, placed upon my desk. Though no one could have entered, it is as though someone or something means to unsettle me." I exchanged a glance with Holmes. He did not smile, as he sometimes did when a client's tale bordered on the fantastic. Instead, he regarded the man with a grave and penetrating calm. "And you have no reason to suspect an intruder of flesh and blood?" Sir Reginald hesitated. "There are servants, yes. But they are loyal, most of them having been with my family for years. Besides, nothing has been stolen, and no one has been seen entering or leaving at odd hours. The shadow, Mr. Holmes. It moves, though no man stands to cast it." Holmes leaned forward slightly, the faintest glimmer of interest in his eyes. "And the name of your residence?" "Penmore Hall, in Surrey. I inherited it 3 years ago, upon the death of my father. There have been whispers about the place ever since." Holmes' fingers began to drum softly on the armrest, a sure sign that his mind was already alight with possibilities. "Whispers of what nature?" "The villagers claim the hall is cursed," the man said, his voice faltering. They say my father's study, where the shadow is most often seen, was the site of an incident. He died there suddenly, of what the physician termed heart failure. But the housekeeper swears she saw something in the mirror that night, something standing behind him. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 9, the steady chime filling the silence that followed. Holmes rose and crossed to the window, drawing back the curtain. The fog had thickened to an almost tangible veil, and for a moment his lean silhouette seemed carved out of the same grey murk that swallowed the city. "Watson," he said softly, "you may recall that I once remarked upon the curious intersection of superstition and guilt, a most fertile ground for deception." Then, turning back to Sir Reginald, his voice grew crisp and businesslike. "I shall accompany you to Penmore Hall at once. Pack lightly, Watson. We leave on the 9:30 train from Waterloo." Sir Reginald exhaled with visible relief. "You believe, then, that there is an explanation?" "There is always an explanation," Holmes replied, reaching for his coat. "The only question, my dear Sir Reginald, is whether it belongs to this world, or merely hides behind the shadow of another." As we stepped out into the dense London fog a few minutes later, I could not shake the strange sensation that something, or someone, was already watching from across the street. A dark shape lingered momentarily beneath the lamplight, then vanished into the mist. It was then that I first felt it, the shadow at Baker Street. The morning after Sir Reginald Penmore's visit dawned pale and colourless, the sun a faint disk behind a veil of mist that hung low over London. Holmes, in his usual brisk and unemotional manner, had completed his packing before I had even rung for breakfast. I found him standing by the mantelpiece, consulting his pocket watch with an air of impatience that suggested the train's punctuality mattered less to him than the mystery waiting beyond it. "I've always found," he said as Mrs. Hudson brought in our tea and toast, "that country houses possess the most curious breed of secrets. Urban crime wears its motive upon its sleeve. Greed, jealousy, passion. But the countryside, Watson, there the motives lie buried like roots, growing in silence for years before they twist upward to strangle their host." I could not help but smile. "You seem almost pleased at the prospect of uncovering another family's buried misfortunes, Holmes." "Not misfortune," he corrected, slipping into his overcoat. "Truth. The two are rarely the same thing, though they often meet at uncomfortable crossroads." By 9 o'clock, we were in a cab rattling toward Waterloo Station, Sir Reginald seated opposite us, his gloved hands clasped tightly upon his cane. The man's demeanour had changed little from the previous night, still composed, yet with a faint, nervous energy that betrayed his unease. Every so often he would glance toward the fogged window as though expecting to see something trailing us through the streets. "You appear anxious, Sir Reginald," I observed. "Is there reason to believe someone has followed you?" His lips parted, but before he could answer, Holmes cut in quietly. "He believes he is being followed, Watson. Our friend's left glove bears a smear of damp soot near the wrist. Not from our cab, which is kept unusually clean, but from the rear wheel of another vehicle. Likely one that passed too close behind him when he hailed his cab this morning. A minor detail, perhaps, yet it betrays a certain vigilance." Sir Reginald blinked in astonishment. "Good Lord, Mr. Holmes, you are correct. There was a hansom that seemed to mirror my path for several streets. I told myself it was coincidence." "Coincidence," Holmes murmured, "is the refuge of the fearful. It is as rare as honesty in Parliament." At the station, Holmes purchased 3 tickets for the 9:30 express to Surrey, and within moments we were settled into a first-class compartment. The train lurched forward, its wheels clattering in rhythm with the beating of my own curiosity. London's fog receded behind us, giving way to stretches of bleak countryside mottled with leafless hedgerows and half-seen cottages. For some miles, Holmes was silent, his gaze fixed upon the smudged countryside beyond the window. Then he drew a folded scrap of newspaper from his pocket, one I had not noticed him take. earlier. "Observe, Watson," he said, pointing to a small column near the bottom of the page. "An obituary from 3 years ago, Sir Alaric Penmore, Baronet of Penmore Hall, found deceased in his study. Cause, sudden cardiac failure. No suspicious circumstances." I nodded. The late Sir Reginald's father. "Indeed, but note the date. November the 14th. Exactly 3 years to the day prior to our client's first sighting of this so-called shadow. An anniversary, perhaps. The human mind is drawn to its own ghosts on such dates." Holmes leaned back, fingertips together, his eyes half closed in contemplation. "It may be nothing more than guilt or imagination, yet when a man insists that his house holds a presence, one must first determine whose presence that truly is." The rhythmic rumble of the train lulled us into silence for a time. Then Sir Reginald stirred uneasily. "There is one more thing, Mr. Holmes, a matter I hesitated to mention last night." Holmes opened his eyes. "Pray continue." "My father's death, though sudden, was not entirely without incident. His valet, a man named Cording, claimed that the study door was locked from the inside. It had to be broken down. When they found him, he was slumped over his writing desk, a glass of brandy beside him. The decanter was full, save for what was in the glass. The doctor declared it a heart failure, but Cording swore my father's lips were tinged faintly blue. He believed it was poison." Holmes' expression remained impassive, though I saw a flicker of interest cross his features. "And was the glass tested?" Sir Reginald shook his head. "No. The local constable deemed it unnecessary. There was no sign of struggle, and no motive could be discerned. My father had been in sound health, if a trifle melancholy of late. But after his passing, several servants resigned abruptly. None would give a reason." Holmes smiled faintly, not with amusement, but with the satisfaction of a hunter catching the first scent of his quarry. "How singularly convenient for the constable," he murmured. "The dead cannot protest a diagnosis." When we finally arrived at the small wind-swept station near Penmore, the landscape had taken on an eerie stillness. A carriage awaited us, a sturdy affair drawn by a pair of black horses. The driver, a thick-set man in a weathered coat, touched his hat without speaking. As we drove toward Penmore Hall, the fog thickened once more, curling over the fields like slow smoke. In the distance, the silhouette of the estate emerged, a vast, brooding structure of grey stone and ivy, its tall chimneys stabbing into the sky. Even at that distance, it had a forbidding air, as though the house itself was waiting, watching. Holmes leaned slightly forward, his eyes narrowing. "There," he murmured, pointing to the uppermost window above the east wing. "You observed that, Watson?" "I did," I replied. "A flicker of movement, though surely no one could see us approach through this mist." Holmes said nothing for a moment, then added softly, "No one alive, perhaps." Sir Reginald's face blanched. "You mean—" But Holmes only smiled thinly. "I mean, Sir Reginald, that we are at last upon the threshold of truth. Whether it proves human or spectral remains to be seen. For the present, I would prefer a cup of tea, a fire, and a brief examination of your late father's study, before the shadows grow too deep to distinguish one from another." The carriage turned up the long gravel drive, the crunch of wheels and hooves echoing against the stillness. Penmore Hall loomed above us like a sentinel of stone, its dark windows unblinking. As we drew near, I felt, quite irrationally, the same chill that Sir Reginald must have known these past weeks. It was not merely the wind or the fog that chilled me, but something else. An unseen presence, silent yet palpable, as though the house itself were drawing breath. And beside me, Holmes, always the skeptic, looked upon it with a curious, calculating gleam in his eye. Penmore Hall greeted us not as a home, but as a mausoleum. Its great oak doors swung inward with a groan of ancient hinges, revealing a dimly lit entrance hall lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow every movement. The air within was still, cool, and faintly redolent of old wood polish and extinguished candles. The scent of a place preserved rather than lived in. A liveried butler of considerable age received us. His name, as Sir Reginald introduced, was Hensley, a tall, stooped man with the solemn bearing of one who had long since surrendered to the gravity of his surroundings. "The East Wing has been closed since the late baronet's passing, sir," he said quietly, "but I have taken the liberty of preparing your usual rooms in the west corridor." Holmes removed his gloves with deliberate care, his eyes roving over the marble floor and the long crimson runner that stretched toward the grand staircase. "Closed, you say, by your order, Sir Reginald?" "Not precisely," Sir Reginald replied. "It was my father's wish that the study remain undisturbed after his death, but the servants insisted the East Wing was unlucky. I have not pressed the matter." Holmes gave a faint hum of interest. How curious that superstition survives so readily where reason fears to tread. He stepped closer to one of the portraits, a somber depiction of Sir Alaric Penmore himself, painted in his later years. The brushwork was masterful, but what caught my attention was the expression, a tight-lipped seriousness, almost defiant, as if the man behind the canvas guarded some unspoken truth. Holmes studied it for a moment, then turned sharply on his heel. "Watson," he said, "you will note that the floorboards beneath this rug are uneven. The indentation there, near the banister. Heavy footfall, repeatedly in the same place. Our friend Sir Reginald likely avoids that section, yet someone has lingered there often enough to leave their trace." Sir Reginald frowned. "But there are only 6 servants now, and they all keep to their duties." "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "Let us hope their duties do not include eavesdropping." We ascended the staircase, our footsteps echoing through the hollow expanse. The gas lights along the corridor flickered intermittently, casting long, shifting shadows on the panelled walls. When we reached the East Wing, Sir Reginald hesitated, his hand hovering above the door handle. "You are certain you wish to begin here, Mr. Holmes? The servants will not go near this part of the house after dusk." "Then it is fortunate," Holmes said dryly, "that I have never found servants' fears to be a reliable barometer of the supernatural." He opened the door. A draught of cold air greeted us, heavy with the scent of disuse and old paper. The corridor beyond was dim, dust motes swirling in the shafts of light from a single, narrow window. We passed a series of closed doors until we reached one that Sir Reginald indicated. "The study," he whispered. Holmes examined the door with clinical detachment. The lock had been repaired, not recently, but within the last few years. He knelt, drawing a magnifying lens from his pocket, and examined the brass keyhole. "This was forced," he said, "and later mended by a professional. The work is competent but not original to the door. Watson, you will recall our client mentioned that the door was broken open the night his father died." I nodded. "Yes, by the valet, Cording." "Precisely. Yet see how the screw here is newer, replaced by a left-handed craftsman. Our Sir Reginald, are you left-handed?" "No." "Then whoever had this repaired afterward, or perhaps tampered with it, was—" Holmes straightened. "A trifling detail, perhaps, but trifles often lead to the heart of the matter." Inside, the study lay much as one might expect of a gentleman scholar. A large mahogany desk near the window, shelves of books lining the walls, a globe half-turned toward Africa, and a decanter with a single untouched glass beside it. Everything was neat, but there was an eerie sense of pause about the place, as though its owner had merely stepped out for a moment, 3 years ago. Holmes crossed to the desk. "You will observe, Watson, that the decanter remains full, yet the surface of the liquid is faintly clouded. Evaporation alone could not produce that effect. Dust, yes, but also residue. A chemical alteration, perhaps." He lifted the glass carefully, sniffed it once, then set it down. "Brandy, but with a faint trace of almonds." "Almonds," I repeated. Surely. Quite so. Cyanide or a derivative, though too faint for certainty after so long. He turned to Sir Reginald. Your father was poisoned, my dear sir. Of that I have little doubt. Sir Reginald paled visibly. Then Cording was right, and the constable wrong. Holmes' expression darkened. More convenient to blame a weak heart than to pursue a murderer, especially one who might reside within the very household. Just then, a sound, light but distinct, broke the silence. A soft rustling from behind the bookshelf. Holmes's hand shot up for quiet. We all stood motionless as the sound came again. A creak, followed by the whisper of movement. Holmes crossed the room in 3 silent strides, his hand brushing against the paneling. Ah, he murmured. A false back. Ingenious, but hardly invisible. He pressed against the wood, and a narrow section of the shelf swung inward on a concealed hinge, revealing a cramped passageway descending into darkness. The air that rose from it was cold and stale. Sir Reginald drew back in alarm. Good heavens, I had no idea this existed. Few owners of such houses ever do, Holmes said softly. Old families build their secrets as they build their walls. Deep, narrow, and never meant to see the light. He turned to me, eyes alight with that fierce, analytical gleam I knew so well. Watson, fetch your revolver. We are about to meet the shadow that walks Penmore Hall. And I fancy it will not appreciate our intrusion. As I drew the weapon from my coat, the light from our single lantern flickered, and for an instant I thought I saw movement. A brief, silent retreat into the darkness of the hidden passage. When Holmes raised the lamp to follow, the shadows seemed to stretch before us like living things, and somewhere below, something, or someone, exhaled. The narrow passage yawned before us like the throat of some sleeping beast. A stairway of worn stone descended steeply into shadow, its steps coated with dust that had lain undisturbed for decades, so it appeared at first glance. Holmes crouched near the entrance, holding his lantern low. The thin flame flickered, catching upon the faint imprint of a shoe in the dust. Recent, he murmured. The tread is sharp at the edges, the heel mark crisp. Less than 2 days old, I'd wager. Sir Reginald leaned closer, his face pale. Then someone has been using this passage? But for what purpose? Holmes rose, his tone matter-of-fact. To move unseen through your house, of course. The architecture of these old halls often conceals such conveniences. Many a 17th-century builder included escape routes, either for the purposes of intrigue or survival. Though in this case, I fancy the purpose is less noble. He motioned for me to follow and began the descent. The air grew colder as we went, thick with the earthy scent of stone and mildew. The walls were rough and damp to the touch, the faint echo of our footsteps swallowed by the stillness. Sir Reginald followed, hesitantly behind us, the light of his candle trembling in his hand. After a dozen steps, the passage leveled out, stretching ahead into darkness. Holmes paused, lowering the lantern once more. Observe, Watson, he said quietly. The cobwebs along the left wall have been disturbed. Broken, but not swept away. Someone passed through recently, brushing them aside. I peered closer and saw he was right. A faint trail of disrupted dust led deeper into the corridor, weaving like a thread toward the unknown. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the dim light. Our shadow walks with a purpose. Let us discover where it leads. We moved in single file, Holmes ahead, the lantern casting long, shifting silhouettes upon the stone. The passage took several turns before opening abruptly into a low, arched chamber, barely tall enough for us to stand upright. The space was small, no more than a dozen feet across, and contained a wooden crate, a battered chair, and a single candle burned down to its base. Someone has made use of this place, Holmes said, scanning the room with rapid precision. But what for? He moved to the crate, lifting the lid. Inside were papers, loose sheets, folded notes, and a handful of envelopes sealed with wax. Holmes examined one briefly before tucking it into his coat. "Correspondence," he muttered. "And if I am not mistaken, written in cipher." I stepped closer, brushing dust from the lid. What could anyone hope to conceal in a forgotten cellar beneath this house? Holmes smiled thinly. "Secrets, my dear Watson. The currency of every household, great or small." Just then, a faint sound drifted toward us, a soft scuffing from somewhere beyond the far wall. It was brief, deliberate, and unmistakably human. Sir Reginald stiffened. "Good God! Someone's there." Holmes extinguished the lantern in an instant, plunging us into near darkness. "Hush," he whispered. "Not a word." We stood frozen, the silence stretching thin. Then, another sound, a faint click, like a latch being drawn. A sliver of light appeared at the edge of the wall, widening into the outline of a hidden door. Through it, we saw the faintest movement. A figure, cloaked in darkness, retreating into another passage. Holmes moved like a cat, quick and noiseless. He slipped through the gap before I could stop him. "Stay with Sir Reginald," he hissed over his shoulder. "If I'm not back in 10 minutes, follow the sound of the river. There must be an outlet somewhere near the grounds." Before I could protest, he was gone, swallowed by the dark corridor beyond. The moments that followed were thick with tension. Sir Reginald stood rigid beside me, his breath audible in the silence. "Dr. Watson," he whispered, "should we not go after him?" "Not yet," I said. "When Holmes gives such an order, it is best to obey. He knows the ground better than we." Still unease prickled at me. The walls seemed to hum with faint vibrations, as though something unseen was stirring behind them. I strained my ears, and then came the sound. 2 sharp knocks, followed by a pause, then a third. A signal. Holmes's signal. We followed the faint trail of his light, emerging into another corridor that sloped gently upward. At the end stood Holmes, lantern relit, his expression one of cold triumph. "You took your time, Watson," he said quietly, "but we have our answer." He stepped aside, revealing what lay beyond him. It was a small iron door, half hidden behind a hanging tapestry. On the floor before it were several sacks marked with wax seals, seals bearing the crest of the Penmore family. Sir Reginald stared in disbelief. "My family crest, but those are from the estate vaults." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "And it seems your so-called shadow has not been content to haunt merely your sleep. He has been emptying your fortune by degrees, using this passage to smuggle the contents from your vaults unnoticed. A clever operation. Ghosts make excellent distractions for thieves." Sir Reginald's face hardened. "You mean someone in my household is responsible?" Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Someone with access, familiarity with the old architecture, and a preference for left-handed tools. A man who repaired a door he himself had broken, a man named Cording." "The valet?" I exclaimed. "Indeed. He was the only one present when the elder Sir Alaric died, and he alone would have known of this passage's existence. When his employer's sudden death threatened exposure, he fled, only to return in secret once the house grew silent again." Sir Reginald shook his head in disbelief. "But Cording vanished years ago." "Not vanished," Holmes said softly, "merely hidden. He has been living under your roof all along, moving by night through these walls. Your shadow, Sir Reginald, is flesh and blood, and he has grown bold." At that instant, a sharp noise cracked through the passage, a footstep, too close for comfort. Holmes turned sharply, raising the lantern toward the sound. There, half emerging from the darkness, was a man, gaunt, hollow-eyed, his clothes disheveled and his face ghostly pale. In one trembling hand, he held a small pistol, in the other, a piece of torn paper. "Mr. Holmes," he rasped, "you should have left it alone." The lantern light trembled against the stone walls as Holmes regarded him steadily, his voice low and cold. "Ah, Cording, I was wondering when you would make your appearance." The man's eyes flicked between us, wild and cornered. "You don't understand. He deserved it. They both did." And before Holmes could speak another word, the shadow at last found its voice and raised the pistol. For a fraction of a second, the flickering lantern cast a grotesque tableau upon the stone walls, the gaunt figure of Cording with his pistol raised, Holmes standing motionless before him, and Sir Reginald beside me, white as chalk. The silence was taut, broken only by the faint drip of water from somewhere deep in the passage. Then Holmes spoke, his tone as calm as though addressing a client across his sitting room at Baker Street. "You have nothing to gain by that, Cording," he said quietly. "The weapon trembles in your hand. You are not a killer by nature. Whatever crime you've committed, it was born of desperation, not malice." The man's lips twitched into a bitter semblance of a smile. "You think you know me, Mr. Holmes? You think you see the measure of my soul because of a trembling hand?" He took a step forward, the barrel of the pistol glinting in the unsteady light. "No, sir, I've killed before. You know it too well. I killed him." Sir Reginald gave a sharp cry. "My father?" Cording's eyes darted toward him, haunted eyes, but not cruel. "He was no saint, that man you call father. I served him faithfully 20 years, but what he did to her, what he took—" His voice faltered, the words catching in his throat. "She was my sister, and he ruined her life. I could not stand by." Holmes did not move, but his gaze sharpened. "And so you poisoned him," he said softly. "A dose in his brandy, swift, merciful, and final." Cording's hand lowered slightly. "Aye," he whispered. "Swift, but mercy had nothing to do with it." Sir Reginald took an unsteady step forward, his voice quivering with rage and confusion. "You dare to stand here in my father's house and boast of murder?" Holmes raised a hand to stop him. "Easy, Sir Reginald. There is more to this than vengeance alone." His eyes returned to Cording. "You remained here after the act. Why? Not guilt, not madness, but purpose. You hid yourself within these walls, waiting for what?" Cording's jaw tightened. "To make the truth known, I wrote letters, anonymous ones. I meant for him to be remembered as he was, not as the world saw him, but no one listened. So I turned to other means. If the name of Penmore was built upon cruelty, then let it crumble by my hand." "The thefts," I murmured. "The sealed bags from the vaults." Cording gave a small, weary nod. "Aye, his wealth bought silence in life, let it buy exposure in death. I took what I could, piece by piece, and I meant to see it scattered, given to those he wronged." Holmes's expression softened, not with pity, but with the cool understanding of a surgeon examining a wound. "And yet," he said, "you frightened your master with this nonsense of shadows and spirits. You lit candles in empty rooms, left doors ajar. That too was vengeance." Cording's laugh was low and hollow. "It was justice. He feared the dark in his final days, did old Sir Alaric. I wanted his son to feel the same, to wonder if ghosts truly linger, to wonder what sins his house had buried." "Sir," Reginald's voice broke through the gloom, trembling but firm. "You wretched man, whatever my father did, it gave you no right—" Holmes's voice cut clean through his anger. "No right, perhaps, but every motive." He stepped closer to Cording, his movements deliberate, unthreatening. "You see, Watson," he said softly, "our thief is also our murderer, but not the villain of this piece, merely the instrument of retribution long overdue." Cording's pistol wavered. "Don't come closer." Holmes ignored the warning, his tone almost conversational. "The weapon in your hand, 5 shots if I am not mistaken, but the hammer spring is worn. I can hear it in the tremor of your grip. The 4th pull will miss fire." The man's eyes flickered with uncertainty, and in that instant Holmes moved. With a swift, precise motion, he knocked the barrel upward. The gun discharged with a deafening crack, the bullet striking harmlessly into the ceiling. Before the echo had faded, Holmes seized the man's wrist, twisting it downward and sending the pistol clattering to the stone floor. I stepped forward instinctively, restraining Cording by the shoulders. He struggled once, then sagged as though the fight had gone out of him. The lantern's light revealed tears streaking the grime upon his face. "It was never about money," he whispered. "It was about remembrance, about justice for the forgotten." Holmes regarded him in silence for a moment, then said quietly, "Justice, Cording, is not yours to dispense. You sought to punish guilt through fear, but you became a prisoner of the same darkness you conjured." Sir Reginald stared at the man, at this broken remnant of loyalty and vengeance, and his voice softened. "Holmes, what is to be done with him?" Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "He will answer to the law, though I doubt a court will comprehend the complexities of his crime. Still, his confession will suffice. The case is concluded." He turned to Cording once more, his voice gentler now. "Tell me one thing, man. Why remain here, haunting these corridors instead of fleeing?" Cording raised his eyes, hollow and wet with fatigue. "Because, Mr. Holmes, this house was my tomb long before yours found it, and the dead, as you know, rarely wander far." Holmes said nothing. For a moment, none of us spoke. The silence of that underground chamber was heavy with something older than guilt, older than grief. Then, with quiet efficiency, Holmes bound Cording's hands and led him upward through the winding passage, back into the faint grey light of the hall. When we emerged once more into the study, the fire had burned low, its embers casting faint shadows on the walls. The portrait of Sir Alaric Penmore seemed to watch us, its painted eyes glinting in the half-light. Holmes turned to Sir Reginald. "You will destroy that, I think," he said, nodding toward the portrait. "Some houses breathe easier when they forget their ghosts." And as we left Penmore Hall that evening, the fog outside had begun to thin, the moon emerging pale and uncertain through the mist. Holmes walked in silence until we reached the carriage, then said, almost to himself, "There are no phantoms in this world, Watson, only the echoes of conscience. Yet sometimes those echoes are loud enough to rattle even the living." I glanced back at the looming shadow of the hall, its windows dark and still, and thought, perhaps for once, he was wrong. We returned to London the following afternoon, the grey fields of Surrey sliding past our compartment like half-forgotten dreams. Holmes sat opposite me, his face unreadable, his long fingers drumming a slow rhythm upon his knee. The morning's newspaper lay folded on the seat beside him, untouched. I could tell from the distant look in his eyes that, though the case appeared concluded, some recess of his mind still lingered within the cold corridors of Penmore Hall. Cording had been handed over to the local constabulary in the small hours of dawn. He made no attempt to deny his confession, nor did he plead for mercy. When we left him in custody, he sat quietly by the cell window, staring at the fog that clung to the prison yard. I could not shake the image of his face, worn, hollow, yet curiously peaceful, as though he had at last been relieved of a burden too heavy to bear alone. Now, as the rhythmic clatter of the train filled the silence, I found myself saying, "You are unusually quiet, Holmes. Surely even you must feel some measure of satisfaction. A mystery laid bare, a murderer caught. It's as straightforward an ending as one could hope for." Holmes's eyes flicked toward me, a faint smile touching his lips. "Straightforward, Watson? Nothing in this case has been straightforward. The facts, perhaps, align themselves neatly. A poisoned glass, a secret passage, a guilt-ridden servant. Yet the truth of it, that is something altogether less comfortable." I frowned. "You suspect Cording's confession was false?" "Not false," he said, leaning back, "but incomplete. Tell me, Watson, what was your impression of Sir Reginald Penmore?" I hesitated. He struck me as well-born, reserved, and somewhat proud. A man of station, perhaps accustomed to deference. Indeed, proud, but not intelligent, Holmes murmured. And therein lies the first irregularity. The death of his father, a supposed heart failure, neatly closed with no inquiry. The thefts from his vaults unnoticed for months. The very existence of that secret passage unknown to him, yet known to the servants. A curious arrangement, don't you think? I nodded slowly. You mean he lacked the acuity one would expect from a man managing an estate? Holmes's gaze sharpened. Precisely. A man who inherits wealth but not wisdom is often managed by others. Courting, for instance, or perhaps someone subtler still. I leaned forward. You refer to the butler, Hensley? Holmes's eyes gleamed. Ah, you anticipate me. Consider his role, Watson. The perfect servant, present at every key moment, silent as stone. He was the one who ushered us in, the one who prepared the rooms, the one who mentioned the unlucky East Wing. Yet not once did Sir Reginald question him. That kind of trust is rarely earned without reason. But Holmes, I protested. Surely Hensley's manner was above reproach. I saw nothing suspicious. That, my dear fellow, Holmes said dryly, is what makes a perfect disguise. The man knew his house too well. When I examined the lock on the study door, I noted the replacement screw was fitted by a left-handed craftsman. Cording is left-handed, that much is true. But the same could be said of Hensley. I observed it at dinner when he poured the wine. A chill passed through me. Then you believe the butler, not Cording, to be the true culprit? Holmes's lips curved into that thin smile of satisfaction I knew so well. Let us say I believe Cording to be convenient. His confession was plausible, his guilt genuine, but not in the way he described. He may indeed have poisoned Sir Alaric, but not alone. He was a tool, a hand guided by another's will. I sat in silence for a long moment, the rattle of the train filling the space between us. And that will, you suspect, belonged to Hensley. Just so, Holmes replied. The motive, I believe, was less personal vengeance and more practical gain. Sir Alaric's death placed Hensley in an enviable position. Master of knowledge, keeper of keys, guardian of secrets. The perfect shadow. Cording may have been the one who carried out the act, driven by emotion, but the design was someone else's. That hidden passage, those smuggled valuables. Such orchestration requires intellect, and Hensley, I fancy, had plenty of that. I could not help but ask, but why not expose him while we were there? Holmes's gaze drifted toward the window where London's skyline had begun to emerge through the fog. Because the truth is not always best revealed in haste. Cording's guilt was visible, his remorse genuine. Hensley's, if it exists at all, is buried deep. Were I to confront him now, he would deny everything and the law would lack the means to touch him. Better to let him believe the danger has passed. He smiled faintly. Besides, I left something behind. A small test. A test? Yes. On the desk in Sir Alaric's study, among the old papers, I placed a folded note, one written in my own hand. It states that the investigation is not concluded, and that I shall return within the week to review certain discrepancies. If Hensley is innocent, the note will remain undisturbed, but if he is guilty... Holmes paused, eyes glinting with quiet satisfaction. Then by the time we return, he will have attempted to destroy the evidence I have hidden there. And you did hide something? I asked. Indeed. Among the ciphered letters Cording kept in that crate, he believed they were messages of blackmail, but I deciphered them during our journey home. They reveal transactions, transfers of estate funds signed not by Sir Reginald, but by his butler. The handwriting is subtle, forged with great care, enough to condemn him once the time is right. I stared at Holmes, a mix of admiration and unease stirring in me. Then the true shadow of Baker Street was not in Surrey after all, but still moving unseen through the corridors of Penmore Hall. "Quite so," Holmes said softly. "The dead haunt us only in memory, Watson. The living, they haunt by design." The train slowed as we reached Waterloo. Holmes rose, smoothing his coat, that familiar gleam of intellectual triumph returning to his eyes. "Come, my dear fellow, let us see if Mrs. Hudson has saved us some supper. We may yet receive word from Surrey before the week is out." And as we stepped once more into the London fog, I could not help but think of the butler standing alone in that vast house, his every breath measured, his every step cautious, and of a single folded note resting on the late baronet's desk, like a ticking clock beneath the weight of silence. Holmes' voice broke my reverie. "Watson," he said lightly, "you may mark this case among those of the strangest variety. A crime divided between guilt and cunning, vengeance and opportunity. But remember this: the truest shadows are not those we see upon the wall, but those cast by conscience upon the soul." And with that, he hailed a cab, his figure vanishing into the gaslight, as ever, one step ahead of the darkness. 3 days had passed since our return to Baker Street, and I had begun to believe the affair at Penmore Hall had reached its quiet conclusion. Holmes, however, seemed in no such hurry to dismiss it from his mind. He spent long hours by the window, staring out at the drifting fog of Baker Street, his pipe issuing its thin spirals of smoke as though he were studying the very movement of the air. On the morning of the 3rd day, while I was reading the Times over breakfast, a sharp knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, a sealed envelope in hand. "A special delivery, Mr. Holmes?" she said. "It was brought by express from Surrey." Holmes looked up at once. "Ah, the post has found its conscience at last. Thank you, Mrs. Hudson." He took the letter delicately, broke the wax seal, and unfolded the single sheet inside. His eyes moved across the page with quick precision, his expression unchanging, but the faint tightening of his jaw told me all I needed to know. "Bad news?" I asked. He passed the letter to me without comment. The handwriting was hurried, the lines uneven. "Mr. Holmes, I fear I've made a dreadful mistake. Something is wrong at Penmore Hall. Hensley is missing. I woke in the night to hear footsteps in the east wing. The wing you advised I keep locked. When I went to investigate, I found the study door open and your note gone. The servants are terrified. They speak of lights in the corridor and whispers in the walls. I beg you to return at once. There is something in this house that means to destroy me. Reginald Penmore." Holmes rose immediately. "Watson, pack lightly. We take the noon train." "Then your test succeeded," I said, folding the letter. Holmes nodded grimly. "It seems our butler has at last stepped out from his shadow." The journey to Surrey was swift and uneventful, yet the air of that November afternoon felt curiously heavy, as though the countryside itself bore witness to a crime not yet complete. When we reached the small station near Penmore, a solitary groom awaited us, pale-faced and agitated. "Sir Reginald's been in a state, sir," the man said as we climbed into the waiting carriage. "Says he's heard voices in the walls, and the east wing's been opened again. Hensley's nowhere to be found, nor his room slept in." Holmes listened in silence, his gaze fixed on the fog-shrouded road ahead. When the house came into view, its grey facade loomed even more oppressive than before. The windows of the east wing were dark, but one, the window of Sir Alaric's study, glowed faintly, as though a candle burned there despite the daylight. Sir Reginald met us in the entrance hall, visibly shaken. "Holmes, thank heaven you've come. It started the night after you left. I was awoken by a tapping sound, soft but regular, as if someone were knocking inside the walls. At first I thought it my imagination, but last night I heard a voice, a whisper calling my name." Holmes removed his coat and set down his bag. "And you say the note I left is missing?" "Yes, and something else as well. A small envelope, sealed, which I found upon my desk this morning. He handed it over. I have not opened it. Holmes examined the envelope closely. The seal bore the Penmore crest, pressed clean and sharp into dark red wax. The handwriting, I noticed, was unfamiliar, smooth, deliberate, and almost elegant. Holmes broke the seal and unfolded the single page within. "My dear sir, you sought to banish ghosts from Penmore Hall, yet some linger longer than others. The one you fear walks still among your servants, though his name is not Cording. Look to the fire before it burns too low, for truth lies beneath ashes as well as dust." A friend. Holmes read it twice before folding it neatly into his pocket. "Curious phrasing," he murmured, "but revealing." "Then you understand it?" I asked. He glanced toward the hearth in the entrance hall, where a fire smoldered faintly in the grate. Without another word, he crossed to it, knelt, and took the poker from its stand. With slow, deliberate motions, he stirred the embers. Beneath the thin layer of ash lay the charred remains of paper, many sheets of it, blackened and curling at the edges. Holmes drew one piece free with his tongs, holding it close to the light. "There we are," he said softly. "The handwriting is unmistakable, and the ink only half burned. These are the estate's financial ledgers, Watson, and they bear one signature in particular, that of Hensley, in a hand imitating Sir Reginald's own." Sir Reginald stared at the fragments, horror dawning in his eyes. "He forged my signature, but why destroy them now?" "Because he knows I'm on to him," Holmes said quietly. "He means to erase every trace of his crime before vanishing, yet our friend is not quite as cautious as he imagines." He stood abruptly. "Come, Watson. The East Wing. Now." We followed him through the long corridor, the gaslights flickering as though disturbed by some unseen breath. The air grew colder the nearer we drew to the study. When we reached the door, it stood slightly ajar. Inside, the single candle upon the desk still burned, its flame guttering in the draught. Holmes entered first, his lantern sweeping across the room. "Empty," he said softly, "but not for long." He crossed to the window and examined the latch. "Opened recently, within the last hour. You see the smudge of soot along the sill? Someone climbed out, perhaps into the shrubbery below." We hurried outside, following the faint trail of footprints across the damp earth. The tracks led toward the edge of the property, to the small river that wound past the rear of the estate. There, beneath the low branches of an elm, we found him. Hensley lay face down upon the bank, his coat half submerged in the shallow water. The pistol beside his outstretched hand had fallen into the mud. Holmes knelt, felt for a pulse, and shook his head. "Dead," he said quietly. "Self-inflicted by the look of it." Sir Reginald staggered back, pressing a hand to his brow. "Good God!" Holmes stood, his expression one of grave finality. "So ends the shadow of Penmore Hall." He bent to retrieve something from the dead man's hand. A folded scrap of paper, soaked but still legible. He unfolded it carefully and read aloud. "You were right, Mr. Holmes. The truth lies beneath ashes. I could not bear to watch the house I served turn against me. Forgive me." Holmes read it once more, then let it fall into the water, where it drifted downstream like a pale ghost in the fading light. "Justice," he murmured, "rarely comes without tragedy in its wake." We stood in silence as the last of the day's fog began to rise from the river, curling around the dead man's body like smoke from an extinguished fire. And as we turned back toward the house, I could not help but glance once more at the silent windows of Penmore Hall. For the first time since we had arrived, they no longer seemed to watch us. The following evening found us once more before the familiar hearth of Baker Street, its amber glow a welcome contrast to the damp melancholy of Surrey. Outside, London's fog rolled thick against the windows, blurring the lamps to small, trembling orbs. I had scarcely spoken since our return. The events at Penmore Hall, the confession, the suicide, the ruin of an old family, had left a heaviness upon my mind that even Holmes's brisk stride through Waterloo Station could not dispel. He, however, seemed in an unusually reflective humour. Having dined in near silence, he now leaned back in his chair, the fingers of one hand resting lightly on his temple while the other toyed absently with the stem of his pipe. His eyes, half-lidded, glowed faintly in the firelight, the eyes of a man who had solved his puzzle but found little satisfaction in its solution. At last I could bear the silence no longer. "Holmes," I said, "I confess the entire business still leaves me uneasy. Hensley's death was sudden, yes, but perhaps fitting, if indeed he was guilty. Yet you spoke on the journey home of layers to this case, of motives within motives. I can follow the facts, but not the meaning." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then, my dear Watson, let us unwind the threads once more, as one might straighten a coiled rope. It is, after all, in the uncoiling that truth is made visible." He rose, pacing slowly before the fire. "We begin with the death of Sir Alaric Penmore, a man of standing, influence, and, by all accounts, questionable character. His sudden demise was attributed to heart failure, though the telltale signs, the untouched brandy, the faint scent of almonds, revealed poison. A simple enough deduction. The act was Cording's, motivated by vengeance for the ruin of his sister. Yet, as you recall, Watson, I remarked upon one crucial inconsistency even then." I frowned, thinking back. "You said that Cording's confession was too complete." "Precisely." Holmes tapped his pipe against the grate. "A man burdened by guilt often confesses in fragments, not in paragraphs. His speech, his tone, they carried the rhythm of rehearsal. Someone had primed him to accept full blame." I sat forward, my interest sharpening. "Then you believe Hensley coerced him?" Holmes nodded. "More than coerced, guided him. Hensley, the butler of 30 years' service, would have been privy to every creaking floorboard, every hidden door of that house. He alone could have known the passage's true origin. For, as I discovered, it was not built for concealment, but for conveyance. The tunnel beneath the east wing once connected Penmore Hall to a disused mill a quarter-mile away, a convenient route for discreet deliveries or discreet thefts." He paused, his eyes bright with that familiar spark of satisfaction. "Now consider this. The estate's finances had been quietly siphoned for years, the money disappearing in small, unnoticeable increments. Sir Alaric, blind with arrogance, likely never noticed, or chose not to. But when he discovered the truth, I suspect there was confrontation, and shortly thereafter, death." "You mean Hensley murdered his master to prevent exposure?" "Exactly. But a murder needs camouflage, and who better to shoulder the guilt than a man already broken by grief? Cording's sister had indeed been wronged by Sir Alaric. The motive was ready-made. Hensley likely showed him the poisoned brandy, whispered words of justice into his ear, and let him believe the act was his own moral crusade. A clever manipulation, but a cruel one. I felt a cold unease settle in me. And afterward? Afterward, Hensley allowed the story of heart failure to pass unchallenged, dismissed the servants who might have known more, and closed the east wing, not from superstition, but to keep prying eyes away from the passage. When Sir Reginald inherited, he found himself surrounded by loyal staff, none more loyal than Hensley. It was a simple matter to continue the thefts, forging the young baronet's signature as he pleased. Holmes began to pace again, the rhythm of his steps steady and precise. Cording's reappearance complicated matters. Perhaps remorse drove him back to the house. Perhaps he stumbled upon Hensley's ongoing thefts. Whatever the reason, the butler turned his ghostly intruder into an opportunity. He allowed the legend of a haunting to take root. Footsteps, flickering candles, open doors. Fear is an excellent disguise, Watson. It keeps the innocent too frightened to investigate. I interjected. Then when you arrived, he saw in your curiosity the threat of exposure. Precisely. My inspection of the study forced his hand. He let Cording's confession play out, knowing the police would seize upon the simple narrative of vengeance. When I departed, I left behind my note as bait, and like all intelligent criminals, he took it. But what he did not realize was that the ciphered letters I had left hidden would damn him utterly once decoded. I could not help a small shiver, and when he discovered this, he burned the evidence. Holmes inclined his head, and in doing so, confirmed his guilt. Guilt has a peculiar scent, Watson, acrid, unmistakable. Once a man begins to destroy, he cannot stop. The moment Sir Reginald saw the fires in the hearth, the letter's words, "Truth lies beneath ashes," became prophecy. Hensley's choice to flee, his suicide by the river, were but the final acts in a play he himself had written. For a long moment, only the crackling of the fire filled the room. Then I said quietly, "You knew it would end this way." Holmes' expression softened. "I suspected. The truly guilty seldom bear the weight of truth when it comes knocking. But do not mistake me, Watson. I take no pleasure in such endings. I prefer when justice arrives before tragedy does." He sank back into his chair, the flame from the hearth glinting off his sharp features. "Still," he added, "this affair stands as a reminder that every shadow cast by fear has its source in something tangible. Ghosts, as I have always said, are the inventions of men who cannot bear to face their own deeds." I smiled faintly. "And yet, Holmes, even you seemed moved by that place, by the silence in its halls." For once, he did not answer immediately. His eyes drifted toward the window, where the fog pressed softly against the glass. "Perhaps," he said at last, "because Penmore Hall was a house haunted not by spirits, but by conscience. And conscience, my dear Watson, is the only ghost that follows us everywhere." He rose then, striking a match to relight his pipe. The soft scent of tobacco filled the room. Outside, the city's endless murmur continued, indifferent and alive. And as the evening deepened, I found myself once again marveling at the strange duality of my friend. A man who could pierce the darkest labyrinths of deceit, yet remain untouched by the sorrow that lingered in their depths. Holmes exhaled a thin plume of smoke, his eyes returning to the fire. "I fancy," he said, "that the case of the shadow at Baker Street will rest here, in silence. But remember, Watson, the truest mysteries are those that leave no trace but the whisper of a name, fading in the fog." And with that, he closed his eyes, the great detective at peace, if only until the next knock came upon our door. Winter came swiftly to London that year. The fog thickened, the streets gleamed black beneath the gaslight, and the wind that crept along Baker Street carried with it the sharp scent of frost and coal smoke. In those short, dim days, Holmes retreated once more into the quiet rhythm of study. Experiments at the chemical table, stray monographs half written, and the occasional case from Scotland Yard to stir his restlessness. Yet even in his moments of apparent leisure, I sensed that his mind had not fully released its grasp on Penmore Hall. More than once, I found him standing by the window long after midnight, his lean figure framed by the faint orange glow of the street lamps, pipe forgotten between his fingers. When I asked what occupied his thoughts, he would merely reply, "The nature of shadows, Watson. They are curious things, bound by light, yet never entirely dispelled by it." By mid-December, the matter seemed all but closed. The newspapers printed a brief account of Hensley's death, filed neatly among the miscellanea of the day. Tragic end of a faithful servant. An apparent suicide in Surrey. No mention was made of forgery, theft, or murder. Sir Reginald, at Holmes's subtle urging, had chosen to suppress the details. "Let the Penmore line rest," he had said, his voice weary. "We have been haunted long enough." I might have agreed, had it not been for what occurred some 3 weeks later. It was a cold morning, the kind where even the fire seemed reluctant to burn. Holmes and I were breakfasting in companionable silence when Mrs. Hudson entered with a letter upon a small tray. "This just arrived, sir. By hand, not post." The messenger said it was of some urgency. Holmes took it, his brow furrowing as he examined the envelope. It was thick, of fine cream paper, but what caught my eye was the seal, the Penmore crest, pressed in dark red wax. For a moment, Holmes said nothing. Then, with that unhurried grace of his, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter. His eyes moved swiftly across the page, and for the briefest instant, something, surprise perhaps, flickered across his usually impassive face. Without a word, he handed it to me. The handwriting was elegant, measured, and entirely familiar. "Mr. Holmes, forgive the intrusion, but recent events compel me to write. You are correct. My butler was not the only one who profited from deception. In reviewing the estate's affairs, I discovered accounts under names I do not recognize, all drawing from Penmore funds long before my father's death. I fear the rot ran deeper than we knew. Moreover, last night I heard the knocking again, 3 times, upon the walls of the east wing. I thought it an echo of the past, until I saw the light. The study candle, Mr. Holmes. It burns again. I beg you, come once more to Penmore Hall." "Ah, Penmore." I looked up in astonishment. "Good heavens, Holmes, you don't mean—" But Holmes had already risen, his expression composed, his mind, I knew, racing ahead of us both. "Indeed, Watson, the dead may rest, but their legacies seldom do." He turned toward the fireplace, the letter still in his hand. "Curious, is it not? A house so steeped in deceit that it continues to breathe lies even after its keepers are gone." "You think the knocking genuine, then?" I asked. "Another accomplice, perhaps?" He did not answer immediately. "An accomplice, or a conscience?" He folded the letter carefully. "In either case, the truth will not remain buried. We return to Surrey tomorrow." That night, Holmes was uncharacteristically silent. He played the violin, not with the fervor of analysis, but with a strange, subdued melancholy. The melody, low, wandering, and unresolved, lingered in the air long after the final note had faded. We departed early the next morning. The journey was grey and uneventful, yet I could feel the tension winding around Holmes like an invisible thread. He spoke little, save for the occasional dry observation about the changing landscape. Only once did he turn to me and say, "You recall, Watson, that I remarked upon the nature of guilt, how it lingers where logic sees only emptiness. Penmore Hall may yet prove the rule." When we reached the estate, dusk had already fallen. The house loomed darker than before, its windows blind, its chimneys smoking faintly against the pallid sky. Sir Reginald met us at the door, his face drawn and pale. "You came," he said quietly. "Thank God. I did not imagine you would believe me." "I believe in what I can prove," Holmes replied. "Show me the study." The corridor was as I remembered, long, dim, and cold. When we entered the study, the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. Upon the desk, a single candle indeed burned, its flame steady and tall, though no one else was in the room. Holmes approached it slowly, his eyes darting over the desk, the hearth, the window. Then, without warning, he extinguished the candle with a sharp breath. In the instant of darkness that followed, I heard it. 3 soft knocks from somewhere within the wall. Holmes froze. "There," he whispered. "You heard it too?" "Yes," I murmured, my pulse quickening. "But where?" Holmes moved to the far corner, pressed his hand against the paneling, and gave a short nod. "A loose partition. Not a ghost, but a message." He drew his knife from his coat and pried at the edge. The panel came away with a dull crack, revealing a narrow cavity within the wall. Inside lay a small wooden box, wrapped in aged cloth. He lifted it gently to the desk, undid the clasp, and opened it. Within were papers, yellowed, brittle, and bound with twine, and atop them a small brass key. Holmes glanced briefly at Sir Reginald. "Your father's handwriting," he said, sifting through the documents. "These are confessions. Letters never sent. He knew his crimes would find him, and he meant to destroy these records before they did. It seems Hensley kept them hidden instead, using them to secure his own position." Sir Reginald sank into the chair, his face ashen. Then the knocking. "Merely the vibration of wood expanding near the flue," Holmes said softly. "But chance, Watson. Chance has its own sense of drama. The candle, the knocks, the ghost, all born from guilt, yet sustained by accident." He closed the box and set it aside. "The shadow at Baker Street has followed us, you see. Not as a phantom, but as a principle. Wherever deception lies long enough in the dark, it grows form and substance, and those who live within its reach mistake it for something supernatural." As we left the study, I cast one last glance behind us. The extinguished candle sat upon the desk, its smoke curling faintly upward, like a spirit departing. On the train home, Holmes was silent once more. Only as the lamps of London began to glimmer through the mist did he speak. "The case is complete, Watson, but it leaves behind a truth I cannot easily set aside." "What truth is that?" I asked. "That man fears shadows not because he cannot see them," he said, gazing out into the fog, "but because he suspects they see him." And with that, the great detective fell, silent, the rhythm of the train carrying us forward into the deepening dark, toward Baker Street and the next shadow waiting to be named. It has now been many years since that winter when Holmes and I concluded what he would later, somewhat reluctantly, refer to as the shadow at Baker Street. I write these words in the quiet of my Kensington study, long after the familiar rooms of 221B have passed into memory, and the city, once alive with the cries of cabmen and the glow of gaslight, has softened into the steady hum of a new age. Yet of all the cases we shared, none has lingered in my mind quite like that strange and somber business of Penmore Hall. In my long association with Sherlock Holmes, I witnessed him dismantle every species of deception, the jealous, the greedy, the insane, and the vengeful. But never before had I seen him confront a crime so thoroughly soaked in regret, a crime whose punishment was not measured by the law, but by the slow, corrosive force of guilt itself. He would often say that conscience is the only detective whose investigation never ends. And in the Penmore affair, I believe he found the perfect proof of that statement. For months after our return, Holmes rarely spoke of it. There were new mysteries, of course, ingenious puzzles that drew his mind from darkness back to the realm of pure deduction. Yet I could sense, beneath his brisk exterior, a kind of restlessness. He had exposed every lie at Penmore, traced each thread of guilt to its source, and still he seemed unsatisfied. One evening, as we sat by the fire, I asked him plainly what troubled him. He regarded me for a moment in silence, his profile etched sharply against the glow of the hearth. "Watson," he said at last, "there are certain truths which, once uncovered, offer no triumph. The Penmore case was one such truth. You see, I laid bare the machinery of deceit. Yet in doing so, I merely revealed how ordinary men become architects of their own torment. Every wall in that house had absorbed a secret, and by breaking them open, I merely let the ghosts escape. I protested that he had done justice, and that the law, however imperfect, had at least been served." But Holmes shook his head. "The law, my dear fellow, concerns itself with action. I concern myself with cause. It is the cause that haunts me." After that conversation, I noticed a subtle change in him. He grew more reflective, even gentle in manner. The sharp impatience that once defined him softened into something I can only describe as compassion, though he would have mocked the word. When clients came with tales of supposed hauntings or curses, Holmes no longer dismissed them outright. Instead, he would listen, his gaze steady, his voice calm, and only when the facts had been drawn forth would he offer the same quiet conclusion. There are no ghosts here, only consequences. In time, I came to realize that the shadow at Baker Street had altered him more deeply than any case before or after. It had shown him that reason, however brilliant, could not erase the tragedy left in the wake of truth. Logic might explain the cause of fear, but it could not banish the emotion itself. There was something in the darkness of that old Surrey house. The whispered knocks, the dying candle, the weight of unspoken remorse, that lingered with him like an echo long after the facts had been resolved. Years later, when I read that Sir Reginald Penmore had sold the estate and moved abroad, I sent Holmes the notice from the Times. He replied with a brief note in his characteristic hand. "So the house has changed owners, Watson. Good. Some dwellings are too saturated with memory to permit the living any rest. It is not ghosts that ruin such places, but remembrance." That was the last he ever wrote to me on the subject. I often wonder what Holmes truly thought in those long hours when he stood by the fire, silent and distant, his mind walking paths no other could follow. Did he believe, as he always claimed, that every mystery yields to logic? Or did the Penmore affair leave some faint crack in that certainty? Some quiet acknowledgement that human nature contains its own unsolvable shadows? There were times, especially in his later years, when I caught him glancing toward the corner of our old sitting room, not with fear, but with a kind of thoughtful melancholy, as though listening to a voice just beyond the edge of hearing. Once, when I remarked upon it, he smiled faintly and said, "The house has its memories, Watson, and so do I. Perhaps we both hear them when the wind is still." Of course, such moments were rare, and the great detective remained, to the end, a man of formidable reason. Yet I believe, though he would never have admitted it, that the case of Penmore Hall touched something within him that neither science nor deduction could wholly define. It reminded him and me that beneath every calculation lies a fragile human pulse, that truth, when unearthed, is seldom pure and never simple. It is strange now to walk through London and hear how time has washed away the sounds of that old world, the clip of hooves, the murmur of fog, the steady tread of Holmes's footsteps on the pavement. Yet sometimes, on evenings when the light fades just so and the air grows heavy with that familiar chill, I fancy I can still hear him, the scrape of his violin, the soft turn of a page, and his voice, measured and sure, saying once more, "The shadows, Watson, are never gone. They merely wait for the light to find them." And in that moment the years fall away, and I am again the younger man at his side, notebook in hand, heart quickened by curiosity. As we step into another fog-bound night, where logic and mystery walk together, and where, in the glow of a single lantern, the truth waits to be revealed. That was Holmes, my friend, my teacher, and, perhaps, the only man who ever understood that the human heart casts the longest shadow of all. Dr. John H. Watson.